Can everybody see this? Reasonable resolution. Thank you. So this will be the card, and I'll go through them briefly now before we talk with John Burke. Yeah, let John in. The second one, we're going to have to go back to the conserved ancestral context as well, because obviously the present day family goes back then. You don't have to linger on this. The idea of repetition compulsion within a family and how that maintains patterns. This one I hope you will find interesting because this is a recreation of Carl Jung's word association test. So if we just for the moment zoom in, you can see the numerograph here that measures chest wall movement. And also we've got the electrodes for the galvanized skin response. And here we've got a word association test, which has been kindly provided with instructions. And there's Jung with his stopwatch. And up on the wall here, we've got the numerograph chest wall movements. Over there, we've got Professor Dr. Eugen Bleuler, who was Jung's chief at the Bergholzli. So the scene has been set nicely for how the psychosocial and biological, in other words, as we would call it, field state of the family complex manifested. And Jung's great credit is that he identified very clearly that complexes are shared between families, we would say, as a field of association, and how problematic that could become. And here we've got the idea of the shared mind as well, with a consultation between a family. And if you look closely, this is our contemporary family and also our Mesolithic family as well. There's a kind of collective representation of families. Then the ties that bind, it's an old medieval idea to do with the connections within families and wider related groups and how that can affect things. And here we get down to some of the more detailed stuff. So I'll start at the bottom with the deep ancestral psyche. I'll just take the headings for now. Frustrated meta instincts, Oedipal electropathology, transgenerational influence, shared psychosocial projections, shared psychosomatic symptoms, attachments and abuse, and individuation neurosis occurring within the family, the field of the family complex, a multi-generational psychic field that shapes identity, emotion, behavior, and destiny, guilt complexes, victim triangle, family scapegoating, Adlerian compensation neuroses, transference infodynamics, and codependency. So looking at all of them, that's enough work, I'm sure you can appreciate. But that's only the beginning, because we have this, leaving the family complex, again, starting at the bottom. Rediscover the ancestral psyche, adapt to natural lifespan development, accept peer confirmation, develop adult life partner relationships, develop your own philosophy of life, seek meaning in the transpersonal, discover your personal myth and realize your personal equation. And here we have non-attachment to negative psychosocial and psychosomatic representations of the family complex, separate from codependency, competition, and identification with siblings. And this one, which was the key for Jung, separate from the psychology of the parents. So that's it. There are a lot of questions built in there and a lot of areas we can go to. But I do feel still we have to go back to the conserved ancestral pattern and then the repetition compulsion, not only of individual learning and behavior, but also those aspects that persist negatively through misfired meta instincts that interpret the lifespan development of a family and of the members in between. And this should be particularly, I hope, of interest, because this is really where everything comes from in terms of how we approach family therapy. And Jung was the first to systematically investigate the relationship psychosomatically and psychosocially between family members. And a lot of that can be reduced, obviously, to a shared inheritance, but with a mother and father, they do not share, under usual conditions, any inheritance at all, genetically. So it's the dynamics of the family as they interpret and express anything that may be inherited, including the meta instincts, that settle into the eventual field of the family constellation. And what do we do? And what did he do with respect to advising families over things like this? This can lead into many, many things. The ties that bind, this is the overlay of the ancestral psyche, and as that operates in our contemporary culture still, but we are separated from it because most of us never consider that particular dimension. And then we have the field of the family complex, and then leading the family complex. And that's what we intended to cover today. Okay, I'll stop sharing at that point and just throw it open if anybody has anything to offer by way of suggestions or questions before we kick off. Everybody okay, or would anybody like to be the warm-up act before we get going? Should make this fun because the awful it's so bloody miserable, isn't it? John Cleese, for those of you who know him, was a guy's name Skinner. I think he wrote a book with.
I think he may. Yes, I think he did.
He was a psychiatrist. He wrote a book about 35 years ago called Families and How to Survive Them, based on systems-based family therapy. And it was really good, but it was amusing, which made it work. And then there was also an amusing TV show that I cannot find anymore, sadly, on YouTube, called The Wolvis Family, where a well-meaning therapist gets pulled into the field of the family. And that becomes a real problem because he loses himself and eventually loses his own mind. Whereas they all start getting better. And there's something in that, that can happen. It can happen interpersonally with just one person, or, whether it's two at a dyadic level, triadic if you include the therapist. But as you increase that, if you're not careful, you can really lose it because the field is so powerful that if you go into individual elements of it, other elements of that field will start to disrupt everybody else and drain you. So a mechanistic approach to family therapy is economical. A systems-based mechanistic approach can be economical. But this poor guy lost it and eventually ended up doing yogic flying. He levitated out of his chair and wanted to be somewhere else. So that's descriptive of the kind of stresses in a comedic way that can occur when we do family therapy. So there you go. And if we're ready for this, we can jump in. But would anybody like to offer anything first? Any observations based on experiences around family? Ben? Yeah. Hiya, Ben.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Pauline. Happy Mother's Day.
Where you are, yes.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yes, that's good.
A lovely smile as well. Very warm.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing this angle of things. Anytime I've heard about families, at least from a psychotherapy perspective, it's been through family systems theory. I think Murray Bowen and someone else. I don't know. I can't remember all of them. So that's very different. Very different. Just some of it, or much of it, just doesn't seem to really. Again, it seems like that theory promotes more conflicts within the family than it is any kind of overcoming complexes, overcoming codependency, and all of it. It just, so I'm quite happy that you're doing this, and I'm quite happy to consider it from this end, because again, the IPSAR model really is about promoting harmony and unity and reconciliation and things like that. Family system seems to do the opposite. They have things like differentiation, and other concepts that it just seems to do more harm than good, at least from my humble perspective. So I'm quite happy that you're doing this.
Thank you. There's Jay Haley's model based on the work of Milton Erickson, which is family systems based, but it's alloyed, I'll put it that way, with Milton Erickson as processed through Jay Haley. And Milton Erickson was a very forthright individual, and Jay Haley the late Jay Haley augmented that somewhat with his own personality, and some people find it very, very difficult to accept. And where we've used Jay Haley's work, we've toned it down to make it congruent with the rest of our approach. The fundamental dynamics are there, and this is important, isn't it? I think you've raised this. It's how we deploy this model, whatever that model might be, to whatever extent, through our own personalities. And that has to do with the field that constellates between us and other people. But family therapy is very difficult, I think, particularly, and I wholeheartedly agree, if you utilize a systems, I mean a collapse systems, a mechanistic systems model. A field-based one is different, but you have to be so prepared to deal with the individual representations start to emerge that are not expressed openly and can't be pushed away by collapsing into a mechanistic systems model, but are still present. So there are certain skills that can be used to do with working on one person whilst working on another, and then by appealing to the field as a whole that's emerging at the moment, and then being very cognizant of the resistances and inertias that arise out of individual adaptations to the collective complex of the family. So there's a great deal there. And then one final thing, sorry, Ben, it's the introjection of this into so-called internal family systems, which can also be superpositioned, though they don't use the term, on the outside. We find that to be unhelpful in all sorts of ways. But rather than be too distracted by that, I just thought I'd mention it. So thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Okay, would anybody else like to offer anything at this point before we look at the cards and then get into the meat of what we need to know? Everybody all right? Okie doke. Oh. Just bear with me while I find what I've lost. There we go. Okay, everyone. So this is the card, basically, which will introduce the video. Your family, how to overcome and win. Your family complex, indeed. It's the same thing, whether you put complex in there or not. The family is necessarily a complex. So your family complex, how to overcome it and win. So that suggested some kind of competition. And of course, people from Adler's time onward have interpreted that through issues of power and relationship, hierarchy, and the like. And there's a great deal of truth in this because that's how it manifests interpersonally. It's through rank, positioning, manipulation, various things that turn up with respect to how that is exchanged. But where does this come from? Well, it came fully formed from our ancestral past, and it must represent an adaptation that was firm enough, resistant enough, and productive enough to navigate the challenges that our ancestors faced. But if we're unaware of that, if we're unaware that there is an ancestral element to this, then there's a tendency to collapse into normal ego consciousness, and then the interpersonal nature of ego consciousness between people without an understanding of the depth psychology, and then the biology, the ancestral psyche, in other words, that stands behind that. So I would suggest that to be effective, we need to understand the past and the presence of the past and how that works in the present. So moving on from this then, we have the conserved patterns that exist today that originated in the past. And what we have here is a representation of the same family as if they were in probably the Mesolithic by the look of the artwork on the wall, behind, the clothing, etc. So already by then, this would have been a highly conserved configuration, which included specific roles, adaptations, and lifespan development issues. The lifespan development from the perspective of young people and older people are very different. This is a problem which is still present for us today, of course. Younger people are developing their sense of self in relationship initially to the I'll call it, for the sake of convenience, the nuclear family of today, in whatever form that takes, because we have a whole bandwidth of different iterations potentially of the nuclear family. But from the ancestral psyche, it was more likely to be this, more likely to be interpreted as being this, or in an extended way, support from the group, the kin group more widely, if the parents, for whatever reason, were no longer around. But it's against that backdrop that the individual conscious ego personalities of the developing male and female children in any generation would have developed. This is problematical. We know this. It is for us. It's been that way for all of us. But it was a serious matter of survival in those days, far more even than now. What we have now, although it may not feel that way, are a whole bandwidth of luxuries, which mean that we can generate more options for neurosis in terms of how they appear. But things were much simpler then. There were more constraints on our adaptation. But that ancestral echo is still there. We've discussed before how instincts can get into conflict with one another as they compete for space in the window for lifespan development. And that's something else which is not properly understood, because most psychotherapists and psychologists look at the more obvious psychosocial and intrapersonal and interpersonal aspects, which we could collapse into psychology as such. But the biological elements are there, they never go away, and they push, our instincts push from within this deep field. And because there needs to be competition for adaptation, that means meta instincts are going to compete between themselves. That pressure produces challenges of adaptation, which bring about individual complexes set against the background of the collective complex, the interrelational field of the family. So the meta instincts are present for everybody. They push between stages of lifespan development, and they generate complexes which are specific to that stage of development, and also to the smoothness of that development. And of course, it never is it? It's never perfectly smooth. It's more like a sawtooth pattern, where there are peaks and troughs that are present as a baseline at every stage of life. So it's not like a spear. It's like a horizontal line with sawtooth on it. And where there's overlap with others, there's relative harmony. But where some people's peaks match our troughs, then you have the highest level of incongruence by age of development, for example. And that's from the point of view of developing members of the family. It's the case now, it would have been the case then. For the adults, it's different back then, and their meta instincts would have to do relatively unconsciously, but they would still be directed to do it, to conserving the family, because that conserves the inheritance, the genome. So rites of passage and adaptation and dealing with time-released hormone changes and so forth would have been harsher and more constricted than they are now. And that allows us to have an extended childhood and an extended adolescence, which means that we run into challenges that didn't exist then. So when Jung talked about the puer aeternus in both its forms, male and female, then he was already beginning to see the consequences of an extended childhood buffered by fantasies. But now it's even worse. The imagistic and representational environment that young people have to deal with appears to offer an escape from adaptations that the meta instincts experience in the past and anticipate in the present. And as we know, that causes all sorts of issues. And it's done that with interpretations of Jungian psychology that occur out there at the moment, with some very young pseudo podcast gurus who are interpreting Jung in their early 20s, for example, or even early 30s, when Jung said, don't go near my work until you're in, at the very minimum, your mid-30s, and then you start again. It doesn't matter what you've learned before, you start again. Because otherwise, for him, the presence of Freud instinct and the presence of Adler social adaptation and the instinctive demands that regulate that, Jung would have said archetypal, are still present, again, whether we're conscious of them or not. So according to him, we stand no chance of developing properly until we've dealt with Freud and Adler. And as a baseline minimum for him, that was 35. The problem today is we have this extended childhood, which moves into the internet and the representations that gather around that, which are fed by some aspects of Jungian theory, because Jungians are so interested in fantasy and in symbols. It provides, at a Freudian level, an escape, a displacement, a withdrawal from life. Jung himself would have agreed with that, and so would Adler. So today, then, we have problems which didn't directly exist in the past, but the presence of the past means the challenges of the past still challenge us with respect to our adaptations. And this is a cause of a lot of issues in families, because you have generational differences. You have people old enough to know what it was like before the internet, before podcast pseudo-gurus ever existed, before Jung was popular, before woke, before all of that. None of that existed when the parents, most of them of today who have, say, children in their late teens, early 20s and so forth, when they were young, none of that existed. There were other challenges, of course, which presage the ones that we've got now. It's been a general move in that direction. But when they dealt with the pressures of the ancestral psyche, it was still easier for them to do it. And this is one of the malaise issues that we have today, isn't it? Is how a lot of young people escape into fantasy and find psychological theories and fake gurus as being the means to do that. And of course, they're ruthlessly exploited at a Darwinian level by these internet fakes. So this is the problem. We have a conserved ancestral pattern, and we have the potential for conflict of interests with respect to instincts that would have been present then, but it's worse now. Far worse, because of the capacity we all have, particularly in young and inexperienced people, to generate this panoply of complexes and fantasies. So we could say with Freud that instincts are a problem, or we could say with Jung that instincts and their self-portrait, what he called archetypes, are the solution. Let's progress and see how that would work out. Well, in the present typical nuclear family representation, this is taken from, just as an example, middle class America. You very often have a repetition compulsion, which means adaptations that were laid down start to be repeated on the basis of familiarity. And people start to adopt roles in respect of one another. And that generates a field of inertia within the family that is actually paradoxically supported by some aspects of the ancestral psyche, which would have experienced contractions and threats within life that meant that the experience of an individual had to contract around core ideas just for survival. So that instinctive pressure is there. If the genome assesses a situation within a family and says that he just isn't working, we have to contract around core issues. Then complexes step in, and as they do, they start out protectively for individuals, and then they gain autonomy, and then within that autonomy, they regulate the family. And that means they have to cap and distort compensations arising out from the genome. So the meta instincts are blunted and displaced and laterally distributed within the field of the family, causing all sorts of problems. But the family get used to it. This is the norm. They start to become actors, but they haven't written the script. The script was prepared hundreds of thousands of years ago, and has now been edited by a director, which is the field of the family complex. And each of those actors follows the direction of the director, which, as I say, is now the family complex. And then we get this inertia, this stasis, this lack of adaptation, an overextended childhood, which will affect also middle-aged parents. who themselves are then under the influence of the family complex to act like children themselves, to act as if they too are conserved and can't deliver their maturity because the maturity is not being received by the children, by the young people. And then the adults start to fall out between themselves. And then we see the kind of thing that the Jungians pick up on when they talk about anima-animus issues. Because again, the attempt to compensate for a situation like this will appear in that representational form. And they start to blame one another at the parental level. And then the children learn about that. And then the meta instincts are further distorted by it. So the Jungian anima-animus, we say relating function and relating system, operate within the family to generate representations that can be interpreted by collapse into a Jungian model of anima-animus, for example. But when we do that, we lose the field nature, because Jungian analysis is essentially an individual process, an individual and a therapist. So it focuses on the individual by taking them out of their context. It's very rare for Jungians to deal with relationships. It does happen, but it's rare. And it's almost non-existent, almost about working with families, family groups. So by abstracting individuals out, they then disturb the field of the family. And that can generate attachments to therapists, which are almost cult-like. And it means the suppression of homeostatic and healing meta instincts by them being replaced by fantasies based on Jungian archetypal theories. And in our experience, we've worked with families and we've tried with all sincerity to utilize Jungian psychodynamics and models and methods. And we found pretty quickly that what I've just said occurred, didn't it? There was a separation of the children from the adults and the adults from each other by focusing on that kind of thing, which was abstract. The alternative, the only alternative then appeared to be working in the way that Ben was telling us about before, which was a very mechanistic family systems model. But that was so abstract that people felt they were being compelled to contract and lose their individuality according to some common baseline where they were treated almost behaviorally with respect to changing their behavior and somehow regulating the family. So it remains a system which accommodates individuality. That sounds great at a cognitive level because it's just an idea, but it is an abstraction. It does not take into account the pressure that comes from instincts and the fact that the genome is pushing at each level of development in all of the individuals involved towards them optimizing, but it blunts the scattering effect of desiccation by suggesting that there is a collective that we can all sample together that is based on instinct and adaptation, that gives us freedom to develop individually. That's really important because when that happens, a lot of the tension goes out of the family. The family becomes much more tolerant. There's an understanding of lifespan development, and there is a mutual respect for stages of life. So you typically then get a reduction in pressure. That's the most important thing to do to bypass resistance in family members. There may be a key family member in this image, for example. Perhaps it's the mother. She may well regulate the emotional life of the family. But because she may not know she's doing that particularly consciously, but only as a suppressed or repressed instinctive drive, then she's likely to get into conflict with her husband, who may not understand or have any sympathy at all for what he may regard as being female instincts within the field of the family. So he may feel isolated, and then his own meta instincts will boot up a response to that, which feels right, but is nevertheless not optimized for healing the family. So then we get an issue between the husband and the wife, and then the children are soaking this up and saying, that's what it means to be a woman. And the son might say, that's what it means to be a man. That's how I'm going to relate to women in the outside world. Just as the daughter might say, I'm not having this. If I do get a relationship and I do have children, I will not put up with this. So the family then becomes the incubator for everything that's going wrong in our culture at the moment, because primarily the separation from instincts, and those instincts to get through are filtered by complexes into distortions which feed the complexes and not the field of the family. And that generates repetition compulsion, doesn't it? We've seen loads of people like this, haven't we, Paula, over the years?
Yes, we have. There's so much to come. You've said so much, Steve. So much.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's just that potentially there's so much to come back on. I think as you're suggesting that if you have a field approach, it's very different from trying to work with individual members of a family. I'm talking now as a therapist, and then slotting that person back into the context, which is already dysfunctional, and hoping that the change that then reverberates around that family will be a positive one. I mean, I would say it's quite unique for even if the approach is something like family systems therapy, for the complete or the entire nuclear family to turn up together. So to get that kind of full representation as we're kind of seeing now on the screen of 4 people, I would say in practice is quite rare. You know, you might get the parents turning up first, or one or other of the parents, or you might get both parents and one of the children, but not the other children. So in that sense, you never, when I say never fully working with the field, you might be by proxy in the sense that even the people who are absent in the consulting room are still present in a way, even though they're not physically present, because it's the field ultimately that matters. But it's a very, very different ball game than simply working with an individual person.
Yeah.
It's very, very different, and I think without going into the mechanistic side and trying to be economical in that way, this is it. Working with instincts is economical too for the collective good of the family, but it's not mechanistic in the way that something like family systems therapy would be.
Yeah.
So I guess certainly as a working therapist, you because of your own energy, I mean, it depends whether you're working with a family on your own in isolation, or you're working with another therapist, or you're working with a life partner yourself, with one or more members of another family. It just depends on how the field configures when you're working clinically, doesn't it, as to how best you can bring healing about for everyone concerned. And I think it's certainly for us, that's always been the goal. It's never been a case of abstracting somebody out and fixing them and not giving a damn about the effects on the rest of the family.
No, that's all you can do.
That's from the get-go. We've always had that approach that if we can make a change in one person, but that benefits everyone collectively, then that's a good thing. But to abstract somebody out of that context and to encourage them to develop themselves in a way that is deleterious to the rest of the family, we would tend to do our very best to avoid that. There'd be quite exceptional circumstances, wouldn't it? As in someday maybe one of the parents has decided that their relationship isn't working anymore, and they can't stand it and they want to walk away, and they're not prepared to consider any other kind of therapeutic process in order to bring the family together. If that's what you're presented with, then to some extent you have to work with that. But we've always begun from the position of trying to work the family as a group. I mean, after all, the nuclear family and the culture, to some extent, are one of the same. The culture is the family of the family. So if you can create a cohesive group within a nuclear family, the chances are then the benefits of that will then spread out into the culture as a whole. But it's no mean task.
No.
As any working therapist will tell you, whatever their approach, it is far more difficult to work with a family and a family complex or constellation than it is with any individual person.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So just for context, if I can, this is a representation of the family complex, so it's appropriate that the whole family is shown. What you say is absolutely right. And of course, there are specialist family therapists who only work with families. And in that sense, their practice is concentrated in the way that it is, and it's that produces the usual family systems dynamic. But I know, and you know, of course, Paul, that in the past, when we've worked with sometimes one person, we've ended up with the whole family.
Yes.
And in some cases, 3 generations of one family. And all of them have gone through enactment processes, which is another way of working meta instincts through in a symbolic and engaged way. So there's so many levels, so many ways that things happen. Other times, and I know you'll remember most of these, if not all of them, we've started with a family, we've ended up with one member. So it's actually gone the other way. It's been collapsed down. And sometimes it might be the child or young person in particular. I remember that one who, there's a movie, wasn't there, with the these worms or snakes just dive under the sand and come up again.
Yeah.
That would be about 1992, I think. But I've always remembered it because of the intensity of his attachment to the imagery of that. And that you ended up working with him, and we both started with the whole family.
That's true.
But though he wasn't the cause, he was the right regulatory level to correct for the family within the constraints that we found ourselves operating within.
Yeah.
So from the level of the consideration of therapy, that's one thing. From the level of the consideration of the family complex, that's another, because as you rightly say, that exists anyway.
Yeah.
So trying to do 2 things with this, really, and with the discussion. One is represent family, represents its origins as a unit, why evolution, natural selection has shaped it the way that it has, how it's present now, and then what do we do about that and the different influences and what can go wrong. I mean, I've worked with most of the children, in fact, all of them that I can remember that I've worked with, started out with some family issue, even if it was only one parent.
Yeah.
That brought the child, and then you work on the child to cure the parent of the symptom that the child has because of the issue in the parents, that the parent will not see, will refuse to see, because the child is the scapegoat. The child has to carry the disorder. What I'm thinking of in particular was a child who'd been a lifelong stutterer and stammerer. And that was a reaction to the family. But the family was a no-go area. The child was scapegoated and produced that. And he'd had a lot of speech therapy. And he was very much into Pokemon. I didn't know what that was particularly. I was aware of it in a particular direction. But rather than engage with that, what I did was accept it, which was sufficient to gain rapport. And then I found out, because it had to do with speaking, not the anxiety about speaking, but what music he liked. Once we got what music he liked, then did he ever sing along to the music he liked? And it turned out that he did. And we had a metronome. And so we got rid of the symptom of stammering and stuttering by getting him to sing, because he connected with his emotions. Emotions are the carry wave of instinct. So that way, which is a roundabout way, we got into the field, if you like, of the meta instincts that were ready to compensate for his symptoms. But as well as that, I did capnograph him, and I found he had very lightly got all sorts of smooth muscle spasm around the throat as well, to do with that. So once we used hypnosis with him, he was chaperoned whilst that happened, obviously because of his age. And then the capnograph normalized. He started to be able to speak and sing as per normal, and that would help to bring him back into the field of the family, where he could act as an agent to change them, because their state was now incongruent with his progression. And very often when someone changes autonomously, the field of the family resists that. But because it was put into a medical context, this young man, was a medical referral with his mother. That meant that they couldn't do that. very easily. They couldn't contradict the fact that an outside party, through the doctor, had brought this change about. So they had to change, and they did change, and that was successful. So I mention that because it is so layered, and much of it was done by proxy. But the scapegoating in that, and then there's psychosomatic transduction of stress, symbolic representation. And this was a boy basically who wanted to sing in order to be able to talk, because he could access his feelings, and his feelings were his instincts, and his instincts, of course, are regulated and released by the genome, therefore the ancestral psyche. So if we're creative about how we approach things and we don't collapse into something mechanistic, you can often find things like this, which are the lateral way around the field of the complex that's getting in the way. I know Pauline did wonders with that young boy who had the obsession with, I can't remember,
I can't remember the name of the
you
film.
might remember.
Yeah, he was into Neighbours as well, as I recall.
Yeah, he was family.
Yes, yeah. So through the fantasy families that were represented in that television series, he was getting a perspective on how other families functioned and related to one another. So he had something to compare his own experience with. It's such a long time ago, as you say, but as I can probably recall some of the detail. I think his parents had him later in life, so he was like a second level of family.
Yeah.
You know, they had grown-up children who had left home, and then there was this youngish son that they'd had much later in life. And I think they were deeply religious as well, as I recall. And the mother also had issues, or she'd been diagnosed with manic depression
Yeah.
as well. And I mean, I would on that, I would say that if she did, because I don't know whether she was regulated on medication or not now. So it's such a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
But
I'm sure I can
right,
remember that.
you probably
Lithium, I think.
right,
Lithium.
okay. But she was, if that was the case, she either had a very mild version of it, or she was stabilized on it, because the outcome was that, to all intents and purposes, she was very adapted, very functional, but she was overly protective of him,
Yeah.
of this young boy, to the point of him feeling, I think, suffocated by her almost. And that what you've described obviously was his projection into culture to some extent, to try and get an angle on himself, why he was feeling the way that he was. I mean, I think we worked with some of that imagery and symbolism, and
You did a lot.
helped him with that.
I stepped aside, didn't I?
You did it.
I worked a lot with the parents,
Yes.
and you focused on him
Yes.
within the family group.
Yeah.
And I did my best to keep the parents away from
Yes.
what you were doing, because,
Yeah.
as I recall, they were not very happy with these snake, worm-like sand beasts that were diving down underneath the sand and coming up and attacking people. I can't remember the name of the movie.
No, it'll probably come later. But the point is, I think symbolically, it was very suggestive of instincts coming online, given his age, and so on. So that representation was a daughter working with his instincts, in a way that it would have been inadmissible with his parents. He couldn't have spoken in the way that he spoke to me at that time with his parents.
And what I do remember is you handled it so well, and because apparently, this is important about representations. It looked Freudian,
Yes,
in a literal sense that could be interpreted that way, and then we've got a problem of what do we do now we've let that out.
yeah,
If it's there but it's unconscious, we can still work with it indirectly by appealing to self-regulation, lifespan development processes to normalize. But if that's a Freudian interpretation, take the Jungian one, suddenly it's a snake, and then it's Kundalini.
yeah.
And if you suggest that to a child, you can induce a psychosis.
Or it's an electrocomplex as well. I mean, that Jung may well have suggested that, given the
because it's a boy.
oh, sorry,
Same thing.
yes,
Same.
yeah. Given the the closeness of the relationship to his mother.
Yeah.
And the alienation of his father effectively from that relationship.
Yeah.
But these are all things to consider in the way that I think you were saying the other day about the way in which Freudians have rejected the idea of the Oedipal complex. It turns up, and that's a really good example of it turning up.
Yeah. Yeah, to own his the symbol of his emerging physicality.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah. And how can you do that when you're too close to your mother? You know, there's all the fact.
He knew she was manic depressive, so she
Yes.
divided. But
Yes.
there's so much there.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you'd be the same, but I would suggest that if people haven't experienced this, you're going to, if you work with people, the most unexpected and potent, pardon the expression, symbolism will turn up. And what you do with that is going to be key to how it's managed. The fact that you receive it internally will be very helpful for the field. But if we lift that out and then suddenly start to, as you say, Paul, so
Yeah.
it's the Oedipus complex, or it's it's alchemical and it's Kundalini.
Yeah.
Either of them can cause a major disturbance in a family and in a child. Now, you may hold that image, but how you relate to it should be to receive it, because once you do that, and this sounds almost supernatural to say it, the field will change because it will pick up the fact that you've received it. You don't have to actively interpret it in that way. You can go and talk with whoever you share your supervision with about this kind of thing, but still check yourself, because as you do that, you change representations. So it's useful to go through a kind of ritual process like we basically have done just now. Instead, it can be interpreted as that, but we shouldn't do it. And the important thing is to receive it. Then we don't front load our own field with that for the next time we interact with the family. So in our experience, that's how it's best to deal with this kind of representation. Receive, internally understand as far as you can, but do not make a definitive collapsed interpretation, and certainly do not lead a person into things.
Well, that would be the ancestral way of doing it, wouldn't it? I mean, it'd be almost shamanistic in a way. But with the expectation, I think, as we were saying in the previous video, that the young man, this is obviously a considerably young, even this young guy was just on the cusp of puberty, so he's that much younger again. But nonetheless, it's partly an initiation, and the modern context has to be considered, of course, but there are strong ancestral elements to it that are, as you say, are better just received without necessarily commenting on them or analysing them in an overt way. And sometimes that can be hard because it requires a different kind of attention to what's going on, doesn't it? Really, it means that you in order to be able to receive, you have to put your own cognition to one side. And in a situation like that, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. I think particularly if you're working with a very young person as well, because you still have to be aware of the context and where you are. And to quote Cesar Millan, rules, boundaries, limitations, all of that, they still need to be in place because that's about safeguarding really as well. But at the same time, have the capacity yourself to be able to dissociate from cognition sufficiently in order to be able to receive the symbols that are coming at you. And then you are, for a time, yourself in a different place. It's one of those things that you put it into words, it doesn't sound like much, but it is a deep receptivity, isn't it, to the state, the condition, the field of another human being. You're in the field with them, regardless of their age as well.
So it's not a matter of cognition.
Oh, no.
You find cognition intrudes, but if we then shift focus to it, we lose it.
We do.
The magic is gone.
Yes, that's so true.
It's intuition can handle a field of relationships. Cognition cannot handle in real time. adequately the field of relationships. Cognition is better at the end of a process whereby you make some consolidated understanding of what you've gone through, but in the moment, it has to be intuition. As the primary organizer of our field of awareness, then we have to understand affect, but also representation, which is the interoception of representations in the mind or in the body, because we can react in the body as well, which is important, of course. And that, again, is one of Jung's great insights that he brought to an understanding of family dynamics.
So in effect, the outcome of that particular case study, if you like, for want of a better way of describing it, was to receive the fact from this young guy that he was growing up
Yeah.
in a way that his parents were finding really difficult to deal with, because whatever he stood for within the family constellation, which was clearly something different than the older set of children had stood for. You know, it was almost as if he was special because he'd come late in life, and he was helping to bond them in some way as a couple. It was important for someone to receive the fact that he was growing up.
Yeah, and you did that. You did that perfectly. And again, this is an example, going forward, if you can work with a colleague that you can trust, ideally oppositely gendered, ideally, but it doesn't have to be. So you can partition in that Jungian sense, but consciously, not unconsciously, your roles, and you can trust someone enough to just do that. And then you regulate everything else on the periphery.
Yeah.
It can be very passive regulation, doesn't have to be active at that point, but you can generate a space for someone else, and they operate within that very efficiently then because they're uncluttered. So that's a point that's worth mentioning.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on. Now we're going back now to a very important time. This is a representation of Carl Jung's work at the Bergholzli when he was measuring psychophysiological effects and responses to the pressure of a word association test. So I'll just zoom in here. They have the pneumograph, which of course we interpreted by using a capnograph. The pneumograph is for chest wall movement, and that basically shows the depth and rate of breathing. But he also has electrodes on his fingers as well, and they're attached to a recording device. There's the word association test and the instructions for it. There's Jung writing down the responses as they're being correlated with chest wall movement and galvanized skin response. And his pocket watch, though it's faced towards the viewer, should really be turned the other way around. But that's so he can make some average understanding of the length of delay between a stimulus word and a response, or indeed time any other reaction that may not be verbal but is worthy of making a note of with the word association tests. And up here we have an impression of the pneumograph and its waveform. There's the galvanized skin response. This identifies it as being at the Bergholzli. And there is Professor Dr. Eugen Bleuler, who was Jung's chief, actually one of his acknowledged teachers, along with Pierre Janet. And there we have a picture of the Bergholzli as it was in contemporary times. The great value of this work, in our view, cannot be overstated, but it's largely ignored. This proved beyond doubt that mind and body interacted as one unit, even if we collapse it mechanistically. This is psychophysiological stress testing when presented with ideas that generate representations. And the stimulus is cognitive because it's a word. So that has to be translated out from receiving a word into a representation, usually an image or an emotion, which the person, the subject, then reconverts back into words, whilst the physiology is responding in an apparently dissociated way, but it is not. It's responding simultaneously in its own way. And how we know this is because of the separation in time and intensity of the response from the body to the stimulus word and then the response word. This gives us a great deal of information. And this is with Jung, Franz Ricklin, and others under the direction initially of Eugen Bleuler. The Bleuler handed it over to Jung to carry out these series of tests. At first uncovered things which Jung was sure reflected Freud. They were all working initially in a psychoanalytic framework. They were finding repressed sexual complexes, repressed hostility, the id in both cases. And in both cases, that's instinct. And in both cases, that's interpreted today by neuropsychoanalysis as being the result of Panksepian drives. And the way that we've added to that is to say that Panksepian drives will, when they are frustrated, react in this way, and they will then stimulate the generation of complexes to protect the symptoms, or protect the ego, but then the complex that thus forms under Piagetian rules starts to protect itself. And then what we've added to is the understanding that without a meta-instinctive context for Panksepp fires randomly all over the place. And then the only way of containing the drive pressure is to generate a complex, but the field of the complex may include somaticization, what used to be called hysteria, conversion reactions, functional neurological disorder. It gets collapsed into by the neuropsychoanalysts in our contemporary times, but it's more than only that. Jung went further, of course, and found, as we can see in the next image, that there is a shared mind with the family. The basic psychosocial unit beyond two-person level is the family. The family is the vessel into which the genome pours the ancestral psyche, its drives, its representations, its frustrations, and its conflicts at an instinctive level. So Jung picked up on all of that, and then he said quite clearly that complexes are psychosocial and they are psychophysiological. He didn't say biopsychosocial, and he didn't say, therefore, they are a field phenomenon. But he did understand that consciousness was a field. He got that from Piaget and others who also used the same idea that consciousness is a field phenomenon. And Jung then defined his understanding of the ego differently to Freud as being the center of the field of consciousness. That was basically everything that he is aware of, or any of us are aware of, but also includes all of our beliefs that we identify with. But again, he didn't specify it in that way, and so on. What he did leave behind was a legacy of understanding which was not systematized enough, in our view, to work with people effectively at the level of complexes. Now, there was an attempt by Jungians to develop something very close to the idea of identified with complexes and aligned, non-aligned complexes. And I'll just get his book there. Hall. May not be up here, maybe downstairs. James Hall, who is famous for, in Jungians anyway, for developing a Jungian model of hypnosis, did give us the representational seeds to develop those ideas further, because he had aligned and non-aligned complexes with respect to the ego, but not identified with. And for us, that was the key that was missing, because it was the identified with complexes and the fact that we can have an aligned condition which is not identified with and is not non-aligned with, but the complexes can move between all of those states because of their field nature. That allowed us to do, in our view, much, much better work. And his understanding of hypnosis, unfortunately, was more authoritarian and direct, even though he was a very good man. He was a very good clinician, and he has influenced us, and we do acknowledge that. Our own empirical experience suggested it needed to be more in the direction of Milton Erickson and Rossi to optimize its efficiency. But Jung had all the data here. It was all there. To extend the idea of consciousness being a field into the so-called unconscious, because he talked about complexes having a consciousness of their own, having a physiology of their own, which was a state that they could occupy, and that this extended into the environment. So it's all there, but he didn't make that leap because he started to wander off into archetypes. At the time, his own sanity was under pressure. So he dropped the ball, in our view, and that led, unfortunately, to the historical necessary compensation that arose with cognitive therapies, behavioral therapies, and then the synergy of the two into the various forms of cognitive behavior therapy. That needn't have happened. Had he developed this, that would not have had to have happened. We wouldn't have had that problem. But one of the issues is that he wasn't very good at hypnosis, and he didn't understand rapport that well, which, when you think of how well he wrote about it, is a bit of a misnomer. But that does show there is a difference between a cognitive understanding of a concept, such as rapport, and then being able to deliver it, which is something different again. But all due regard and respect for Jung for giving us this basis. And later we introduced the capnograph because we were able to do so much more with it, having seen it used in other ways by medical practitioners who did not know anything about Jung, but were uncovering things which affected the body and their environments. And they were influenced by George Engel. And George Engel's systems model is such that it delivers an impression of field informational dynamics directly to you if you overlay the symptoms of a person on that biopsychosocial stack. There's the complex in its field state, both defined by and defining each level that it occupies with its exchange of informational representation. And then through hypnosis, that allowed us to go beyond the limitations of active imagination and to work differently with dreams. So the shared mind then becomes very, very extended, and we see how that extends out, as I say, at all levels. And then when you actually sit with someone who is suffering and knows nothing about Jung or Freud or CBT or anything, they only know that they're suffering, then the opportunity is there right in front of us of drawing out the complex in its representational forms, which include the symptoms, the description of the symptoms, the elusiveness of the complex as it tries to play with you through the relationship that you have, how transferences are mobilized by complexes and not by the ego. That's another distinction that we've empirically tested and found in favor of it. Rather than it being the ego defending itself, these are complexes that defend themselves from the ego. And it's them that do all the projecting. It's them that do the transference because it's them that gain from that. The ego does not gain health. It does not gain homeostasis from indulging in these, what Freud considered to be infantile aspects of non-relating. So what would that do? What would that protect? Well, when the complex first emerges along that timeline, of course, it splits off, as Janet understood, it partitions in order to be able to deal with a problem. And if that is suppressed only, not repressed, then there is some functionality. But after a while, we repress it. We don't want it to remember. And the complex encourages that. It's like, forget me, forget it happened. I am you after all. There is no separation. You didn't split and produce me to deal with a problem. You're suffering from the problem, but I'm that part of you that's just about there in the background you can glimpse. You're not making a separation between us. I'll deal with it because I am you. I'm that part of you with all of the competence to do this, to regulate your life and to interpret the future. That's what these things do. And they're so adapted in a Darwinian sense that they can boot off the psychophysiological symptoms to distract the ego, to generate distress, and they can affect behavior to contract the ego into relating internally only with the field of the complex as it's experienced on the inside. That leaves the field of the complex externally, from the two-person right out to the highest level of psychosocial and eventually environmental interaction, leaves it free to occupy and to move between all of those different states. Jung had the opportunity to see all of this. He didn't, but I still, and we both do, don't we, Paul? We still respect him
Oh, absolutely.
for the work that he did, but also bearing in mind he wasn't alone. there were a whole team. There's even an American on this team, and you never even hear the guy's name. You'd have to look for it to find it. It's in Deirdre Baer's biography of Jung, in the part where she covers the Berg-Holtzley years. He made significant contributions, but his name's forgotten. Franz Ricklin is just about remembered, and that's why we call it the Jung-Ricklin test. That is not the official name for it. It's just called the word association test. We call it Jung-Ricklin because we feel that Franz Ricklin's contributions were so high, so comparable to Jung, that when we use it, we call it that. And it does amuse us when psychiatrists, for example, is one who regards himself quite highly in relation to Jung's, goes off to Zurich and starts talking to them about the Jung-Ricklin association test, and they haven't a clue what he's talking about and are too polite to tell him that's not what it's called. So we know then that, and we do know this particular individual did that because it was on YouTube, that he's got his influences through someone other than directly through Jung, and okay, fair enough, these things happen. But the important thing at bottom to understand is that this key work developed by Jung allowed other people's work to be sampled, integrated, and tested to do with psychophysiology and psychosocial interaction. And key amongst them were George Engel, Peter Nixon, Ernest Rossi. And bringing all of that together with the capnograph and with the right kind of hypnosis, we were able to bring the psychodynamic, and now, as we call it, infodynamic therapy for complexes into a new orientation, which Franz Jung knew about, and also Anthony Stevens and Ernest Rossi and Peter Nixon. Because when we introduced him to Jung's work, Volume 2 Experimental Researches, he said, quote unquote, "I'm enthralled by this." He had no idea. But the integration of all of this experience makes for a very effective model. But we do acknowledge the beginning of that.
Or it's a matter of respect, isn't it?
It is a matter.
You don't have to agree with someone necessarily to respect them, or to respect the work that they've done. It's just, I mean, so many people get deleted from history, don't they?
They do.
Deliberately so.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously to silence them. And
It's happened to us
it's a-
more than once.
yes, and I just think it should always be credit where it's due.
Yeah.
Regardless of what you might
Yeah.
think about someone personally, or what you might even think about their work. You have to acknowledge their contribution.
We do. It's a matter of history.
Yeah.
It's also a matter of history that Jung wasn't that keen on promoting his colleagues. And that's a normal Darwinian psychosocial dynamic, and it's to be expected. But it does say something about his character, that his focus was largely on himself. And Freud was the same. Freud comprehensively distanced himself from Joseph Breuer. He would never have gotten off the ground without Joseph Breuer. And then he turned on Pierre Janet as well, and that's a matter of history. And one of the problems for Janet is that he didn't lead a school. He didn't have official students. He just did the work and wrote a lot of things about that work in French.
Yeah.
So he's been easy to sideline and to forget, apart from being a footnote for other people like Carl Jung. So it's important to know where things come from, because when you do, you sample the field of influence around them, but you also have to take into account where they've come from. And Jung's family complex was extremely complicated in and of itself, and basically produced the man. It produced the man in this context, and it produced the later man. That was the trajectory of his life, was settled in the early influences of his own family complex. So when we have enough information and enough ability to access different states, whether that's with a capnograph, hypnosis, creative therapies like Santre or enactment, then we can bring the family complex distribution down into different states that we bring about in order to isolate aspects of it and bring about configurations and changes without being mechanistic, which is really important in our view. Okay, so moving on. The ties that bind then basically are the remnants of the ancestral psyche, which are below the level of consciousness, but nevertheless dictate how people interact. What they're largely conscious of are the effects of the ancestral psyche on how they experience their relationships and their own internal states. And that's obvious. And that's the problem, because people do tend to focus on the obvious. But because ego consciousness is usually non-affective and non-instinctive, then very little can be done about the pressure that comes from those until people realize what's going on. That's why I'm in this state. That's why I'm feeling this. And that's why he or she is doing what they're doing. And then, yes, and it's not a fight. It doesn't have to be a fight. It should be about a reconfiguration in a homeostatic way that benefits all of you, each for the stage of life that you're at. Without the judgment, which is usually cognitive, based on a collapse of affect and instinct into cognition. None of that. Cognition comes later. Learn to receive from within and then feel the field of the other. And then things start to even out. But the ties that bind, literally bind us to collapse cognition, are instinctive and belong in the ancestral psyche. All right, I'll come to this next. I'll pause now. I think it'd be good to do that. There's a lot of information there. I'm sorry, a lot of pressure too, through which it was delivered, because I'm aware I've got to cover a great deal. But if anybody would like to open up the conversation, be very, very welcome. I do understand that was high pressured, and there's even more to come. Could I maybe ask Ben then, if you don't mind, Ben, if I pick on you as an exemplar of the professional field which you are, if you have any observations perhaps to share about how different that might be to the other schools that you're aware of. For some reason, I'm not
No, we're
guessing
not
you.
quite guessing you, Ben.
Nope. And I don't know why. That's weird, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, my audio's working, but I can't hear you.
No, still can't hear you, Ben.
No, nothing coming through. Isn't that bizarre?
It is.
Yeah. Sorry, Ben. Can't hear you. Would anybody else please give us a sound check? Just one person, and we'll see.
Hello.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
loud and clear. Niamh.
Thank
Thank you. Ben, could you try again? No, we're not guessing you for some reason.
No,
Oh, isn't that a shame?
it is.
Oh well. Would anybody else like to offer anything?
I just say that's brilliant. What you just laid out there is just so concise. And
Thank you.
I can certainly go through the whole process which you've spoken about. And if we have time at the end, I'd love to give you a phone call I received yesterday about a whole family constellation. And just go ahead and maybe you have time.
Thank you, Niamh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, can I check back in with you again to see if anything's spontaneously resolved?
Did it resolve?
Yeah, we got you back. We've got you. Great.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think I had a Bluetooth interruption. So that's probably why. Oh yeah, there's a lot jam-packed in all of this. I'm trying to scan through all the things that you've shared and trying to pick on a topic. I don't know which one.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Even how difficult it is a good observation, because it is, and there is so much to take into account. But I think the core of it is the field infodynamics. That's the absolute core of it, which, as you guys all know and practice indeed in your work, is the power of instinct, the unrecognized regulatory power and transformative nature of connecting consciously to instincts.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't know if it was the last card where
Yep.
the father was looking away, the kids are on their phones, and the mom, that card really impacted me about, perhaps, if she is the one that typically regulates the field, or the family, um, we can see the distress on her, how detached the three others may be. Again, that's sort of like my interpretation of that, of that card, of that picture. And then, I zoomed in on the thing that was, the wall, the words on the wall. Most of the battles are fought in silence.
Yeah, I think I found it.
Yes, it is.
It just one of the cards you just showed, just one or two before. The ties that bind, I believe that card right there.
That's this, yeah, the ties that bind. Did you see it then? Did I actually flash that one up? But
Yeah, I saw it. I thought I saw it.
yeah, I mean, just now, because I was just. It happens with me that I have sometimes more than one file open when I'm working on it, and I forget one of them, and it doesn't include all of the cards. But from what you've said, then that's there. So I'll just see if I can get it up again. Amongst all this stuff I've got up. Let's get back into. There we go.
Yeah.
Is that it, Ben?
I can't see. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Just that I see distress on her, or perhaps dejected that she can't pull it off. I don't know. Again, I don't know if I'm supposed to interpret these pictures, but I'm just talking about what stands out to me. In the back, there's a saying.
Yes.
The hardest battles are the ones we fight in silence.
Yeah.
Yeah, that stood out to me. About the family dynamics, and then, the field nature of the family. Again, I think silence plays a huge part in boy, it's an indicator of several things, and one is the family able to connect over whatever. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud as I look at that.
Yeah.
Her field and then her husband's field, they just impact me quite a bit.
Yeah. When I put this together, it gave the context and what everybody should be doing. But when I read out where I was at, I focused on the ties that bind, and I was still focusing on the instinctive nature behind it, almost ignoring the immediate representation. So that's a good reflexive thing for me. And I hope in actual therapy, I don't do that. I do receive the immediate image rather than go to the latent message. And it was just the trajectory I was on, I think, because I've probably been talking too long and I missed it. So thank you for bringing that around. But even the message at the back, part of the construction of the image, and the father turning away because he's just completely got this sense of isolation. There's resignation on the part of the mother, and the kids are in the extended pseudo-psychosocial world of the internet.
But they are all in the same room together.
They are.
Still.
They are.
And that might be where the ties that bind come in. At that deep instinctive level, they are connected, albeit on the surface. They're all very much, absorbed in their own worlds, and they're not actually actively interacting with one another. And just picking up on what Ben said about the mother, well, I guess, again, in that instinctive sense, she will want her family to get on. She'll want there to be a good atmosphere, if you like, within the home. And clearly, in that scenario, for whatever reason, it's not happening. So the instincts are still very much present in that scenario. And as I say, the fact that they could all be in different rooms of the house doing what they're doing, but they're not. They're sharing space, even though they're not sharing it seems, at least on the surface, very productively. So there's something to work with still, I would say,
there is.
in that scenario.
Yeah, and that could be used as a prompt for a family who don't sit together, is the representation of one that are,
Yes.
even though, so
Yes.
it's interesting. It's like a Rorschach or a sand tray, isn't it? And both of them are projective representations.
Yeah.
This is like that.
Mm.
But that's what we have on the inside anyway. We have representations.
Yeah.
And as you know, that we always say work with controlled dissociation, natural dissociation first, because that's what causes complexes. That's how we beat them. And then representation. And it's so vital how we deal with those.
Yeah.
Because some of them are generated by complexes. Some of them are generated by conflict between complexes, conflict between instincts, instincts and complexes, or they're generated by a deep structure complex that says this is what you're doing to yourself. And then behind that, there's the meta instincts. And they can provide also a negative version of themselves to say, this is what you're doing now to yourself, and if you're not careful, we'll agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, in this modern context, that family has almost the luxury of being that way.
Yeah.
I mean, if we were to go back to the Paleolithic image of the same family, so the representation of them in the Paleolithic, there would be all the potential for external threats as well. And obviously, there's been more recent examples of that kind of thing. If we think about for example, the way that families got together after, say, the Second World War, with the threat that was posed by the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation and all of that, often brought families together in a way that it hadn't done in the past necessarily. So sometimes when there's a sufficiently large external threat of some kind, these more superficial differences and disconnects fall away, and families pull together for the overall good of the family group, which is what you were saying earlier when we were looking at some of the Paleolithic representations. So much depends on what's happening in the culture as well, which, as I was saying before, is an extension of the family anyway. Whatever the shape is of that nuclear family, it is nonetheless an extension of it. And I appreciate that the opposite can happen too, that sometimes external threats can actually cause, families to desiccate and to pull away from one another, as did, for example, under COVID. Some families were, destroyed by that. The kind of tensions that brought in and helped to magnify some of the complexes that already existed prior to that happening, actually blew families apart.
Yeah.
But there are some situations too where there is sufficient enough of a threat for families to actually pull together, which, again, it's looking at that foundational instinctive level of things as well. Again, coming back to the therapy context, if you can appeal to people at that level, very often a lot of the other things, the more superficial things, take care of themselves.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's a really good point, because homeostasis for a family isn't limited to the boundary of the family. And this is, I should say, an example of the problem with concepts like Markov blankets for systems. A boundary between inner and outer, it's arbitrary, because we always say that superpositioning implies and directly demonstrates that information can exist on the other side of a boundary that is the same as that on the inside, but altered sufficiently to fit the extension beyond the boundary. And the very sort of obvious is the psychosocial. So the inner state and the outer state are congruent. On the surface, they're not the same, but deep down they are. You change one, there's a kind of entanglement between them, because that means you also change the other. So only a field can do that, and only intuition provides the immediate awareness of that. different or similarity across boundaries. Cognition, once you introduce the notion there is a boundary, it immediately collapses into that and defines inside and outside. And that can be very useful sometimes if you're building ego strength, to say that there is a boundary and I will determine that boundary and I will work on it. But it doesn't remove the extended environment, but it does strengthen the focus of the work at that moment, which will be building ego strength. So it's useful sometimes it's not. But a family can be regulated by the culture. It's being influenced by it all the time. The boundaries penetrated. What manifests within is superposition without. But you can regulate that, and therefore you change the field. And as you change the field, say between two levels like that, you start to change the others. Because homeostasis is looking for congruence and harmony. Because that's predictable. That's one of the problems of a neurosis, is that it's predictable from within itself. And even homeostasis will say, well, it's not optimal, but at least we're surviving. We'll stay just as we are. We won't disrupt it. That might be a surprise, for some people, but I don't think it is. If we look in and if we work with other people, you see that collapse into a suboptimal level of adaptation. It does not remove the optimal level that exists latently and would be preferred. It's just that homeostasis says, for now, it isn't happening. We need a conservation withdrawal into a state which is unpleasant but predictable, because at baseline, that covers survival. Darwin basically steps in and says, we'll do this. But that doesn't deal with change very efficiently. And complexity, of course, but all, as we say, all complexity is distribution. The complexity of the field of a complex is its distribution. That's all it is. So when we change how it regulates, you can encourage it to regulate itself into a different state where it's no longer what it was. But you have to use the same methods, the same pathway, if you like, that has caused the complex to form. That is dissociation paired with representation, so that they are bonded together. And it covers all states that it can and will or might occupy. That's all complexity is, distribution, and you can deal with it. Thank you, Ben.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to offer anything at this stage? Okay, we'll move on. This next bit's going to be quite intense as we go around the field of a family complex. If you can bear with me while I do it, and then we'll look at the solution. It's a bit easier, a bit less cluttered than the actual representation of the complex. Then we can throw it open, hopefully, for a more interactive debate. Right, so we start at the bottom then. It says, recognition is the first act of liberation. Consciousness transforms the field. Healing the family complex heals the lineage. So basically, that sums up in relatively clear terms that when the family complex sorts itself out, then the ancestral psyche is also healed. No matter how long it has existed in this particular form, it will reconfigure. It may even represent itself in epigenetic changes that will be passed on biologically. It will certainly be passed on in a field sense through Sheldrakean infodynamics. The field of the family is a representation in and of itself. But if the genome through epigenetics changes congruently with a Sheldrakean effect, that is the best predictor that we can have of health transgenerationally going forward. So that's an important baseline statement. Directly above that, we've got the deep ancestral psyche. Archetypal and ancestral forces seek resolution through the conscious healing of family patterns. There is an intentionality to do that, and this is the pressure that we feel to adapt. But if there's also these various ground states of suboptimal adaptation, as we've just been mentioning, the people and families will settle for. Nevertheless, the drive for the most optimized and functional adaptation is there. So that means even when we feel settled in our neurotic state, instinct will push and will generate pressure that we can't deal with. And that will either stimulate a complex to form or it will stimulate the ego to change itself, which is the primary purpose of the drive. And moving left then, frustrated meta-instincts, suppression of natural drives, autonomy, creativity, sexuality, aggression, spiritual longing, all of this leads to chronic frustration. That really, as we said before, is the id, but it's also Jung's self-archetype, if we use his language and his way of understanding things, and how the self-archetype is supposed to unfold across the lifespan. The result is the same. The model we take determines how we collapse. There is no reason why you can't take a Freudian and a Jungian perspective as being complementary to this simultaneously, without contradiction, except through the different languages. And if we move forward without contradiction, we increase our conscious understanding of that which has generated the frustrated meta-instincts. Moving up again, Oedipal and Electra or Electra are the same thing, according to Freud. Pathology, unresolved attachment, competition dynamics with parental figures, distort adult relationships. It's the basic of all transference that comes through the Oedipal complex or situation, and whether that's resolved adequately enough for Freud, and it's adequately resolved through the superego, which is a moral position, but that can become punitive as well. Adler, of course, addressed that differently and suggested that simply being interested in people other than yourself will bring about the necessary change. He called it social interest. So we're not then focusing on our frustrations that may be emerging out from instinct. We're choosing to do something which will satisfy instincts. And there is leverage in that view, with many people who have collapsed into themselves because of instinctive pressure, which has not worked. It hasn't shocked the ego into doing something about it. Rather, it's settled into a very disturbed division, not just a background neurosis, but something which is crippling for life. Adler's solution was go out into the world, relate with others. That will overcome all of these compensations. And I said, sometimes that works. Of course, there has to be an opportunity externally to receive meta-instinctive anticipations and pressures to make Panksepp behave itself, shall we say, and therefore sort out Freud and therefore equal the position that Adler took. But that's basically it with respect to solving the Oedipal Electra pathology that occurs within relationships. There's more in depth to that, but that's fundamentally about that. Transgenerational influence, inherited unresolved trauma, beliefs and behaviors across generations. So the inheritance can be simply by transmission through the family of the previous generation, which has bled in a field sense into this one. And bearing in mind that families tend to form out of two primary sources, the respective families of the parents, as they are set against the times within which they live, and then against the deeper ancestral psyche, then transgenerational influence can move down that way, and it can couple itself with meta-instincts and with Panksappian instincts to produce a malalignment of homeostasis with respect to the inner world and the outer world through the medium of the family. Moving along again, shared psychosocial projections, unconscious projections of disowned traits and emotions onto family members and others. So the psychosocial projections here include within family transferences and demands, instinctive demands that take on representational form, which are hijacked by complexes, which then amplify the response that we have to other people and to our internal pressure. So again, this is also part of what goes on with the transgenerational influence level. It's also present within so-called Oedipal and electropathology. It also relates to frustrated meta-instincts. Then we have what Jung discovered and demonstrated empirically. It's so valuable, this shared psychosomatic symptoms, unspoken distress expressed through the body across family members. the habit of not expressing it, the habit of we've all got a disturbance of our GI tract, or we've all got eczema, or wherever it might be, or psychogenic asthma, because we're a family. So the suggestion says it must be genetic. Whereas biology is quite clear that most things like that occur cannot be reduced to, and I mean reduced to biology. It takes the psychosocial element to amplify the signal. But it takes another element too, which biologists broadly don't appreciate from within their discipline, and that is the autonomy of complexes to disturb just about anything and to represent information in any way that they find useful for themselves. Attachment and abuse, early relational trauma imprints and shapes core beliefs, self-worth, and emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is instinctive regulation. It is meta-instinctive regulation as well. Self-worth is obviously the core of our self-image set within the self-concept, and what we experience directly through our Miller number as our immediate awareness. The core beliefs are usually internalized through suggestion and influence, conditioning, if you like, either through the family, through our understanding via the culture, usually of history and so forth. And the abuse is obvious, I think, because that was a core element for Freud. And Jung himself was abused as a child. And that brought about another significant trauma within his family, because apparently it was the friend of a family member who did it, who was a Jesuit priest. Bearing in mind he had a religious complex, that was going to feed into that. And we get to the top here, individuation neurosis. This is something that we discuss a lot in the personal myth. Difficulty becoming self due to unconscious family loyalties and identity diffusion. The identity diffusion is basically what Jung would have understood as an hysterical adaptation to the demands of others. The hysteria being dissociation, which may or may not have physical symptoms paired with it. It can simply have behavioral ones paired with our self-image being occupied and represented by the images of other people's needs, and then how we relate to that. So our identity is diffused into the representation of other people and their needs and demands on us. That is lack of ego strength, for example. And as Jung said, it's a fundamental way in which hysteria gets to people, and we get conversion reactions. Because as we adapt to other people, we are hypersensitive to how they configure their life and their stress and their demands. And as we try to accommodate them, then the conflict within at an instinctive level starts to rise up in the form of Panksepian drives, such as anger, rage, thoughts of horrific intent, as Freud understood them, wanting to harm others, which have to be repressed. As they're repressed, they're dissociated into the Jungian complex, and the complex then regulates the symptoms without a solution, because the solution to the complex would get rid of the complex. The complex is autonomous and it splits off and it wants to survive. But the ego is unaware of that. It only identifies with the product of the complex. It does not see the complex as being separate to it. Because the product of the complex is identified with, the ego thinks it's doing it, insofar as it's conscious at all of the identification. But over the lifespan, that produces an individuation neurosis. So the field of the family complex goes to the very top then, a multi-generational psychic field that shapes identity, emotion, behavior, and destiny. So the teleology is written into it. The field of the family complex is a constraint, but it's also a potential prompt for us to take action to free ourselves from it. And if we can do that, then our destiny becomes determined by other things than other people. It's the genome, it's the related fields of the genome, and it's our own autonomy as an executive, conscious ego that can work with those factors in order to bring about individuation. The guilt complex then, moving around, toxic guilt binds individuals to family scripts and self-punitive patterns. So we talked about this in the guilt complex video, which will be, we hope, released today. So no need to go into that too much, but the guilt complex forms, generally speaking, within the family rather than beyond it. The propensity for it. And to be clear on that, you can have a really supportive family, but be unprepared to meet the demands of others beyond the family. And the shock of that can cause us to generate a guilt complex. Guilty in the sense that it feels as if we are insufficient to the task of life, of adapting to the extended world, and therefore we will just collapse back on the family. But the family perhaps signal that, no, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be doing this for yourself. More guilt. And then there's a split. And then we have all the identity problems, by which I do not mean that in a woke sense of identity politics. I mean with respect to who and what we are and what our competencies are, and what our instincts and our genome intend for us. Instead, it's another form of hysterical adaptation, but beyond the family, beyond the two-person group, beyond the family. It's in most of our interactions, and also superpositioned with our self-concept, which is just simply accepted it and identified with the guilt complex. And the victim triangle, enmeshed, which we can say is entangled by another word, and superposition, roles of victim, perpetrator, and rescuer. This derived originally from transactional analysis. And on the surface, it's a useful way of talking about that, because people seem to move between those states. This is the observation from transactional analysis, which was founded by Eric Berne, who was a former psychoanalyst. So basically, a victim will become a rescuer eventually, because they will want to rescue other people from being a victim. But they then become a perpetrator or aggressor, because that part of it has not been properly dealt with. And a therapist who is enmeshed, superposition with victim triangle field infodynamics will eventually, perhaps, start to become an abusive perpetrator of the patients. They set out to rescue them because of their own wound, but they become a perpetrator. That can happen. It is a valid observation of transactional analysis, but it can be elevated into a dogma and everything else is mixed. And that's a problem with it, but it's nevertheless a feature that can be looked at, can't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just thinking as you were speaking there, just how much, particularly now in the culture that we're in, that is superpositioned. Those dynamics are so superpositioned with the culture, the woke culture as it exists right now, that it's almost made. Those concepts are almost made for it, and it's a shame in a way, because, as you say, it has some validity to it as a model. We can all, certainly see how those kinds of dynamics would operate within the context of a family, but they are also, and have been for decades actually, operating within the culture too. So
Yeah.
we're at a strange point, really, in the sense that it's what you were saying before, Steve, about boundaries. Well, what's inside the boundary of the family is also superpositioned outside of it into culture. And I think we're seeing that more than ever. It's not difficult to see how you could weave woke into that. And basically you're looking at very similar sorts of dynamics, because you're looking at the power structures, for example, within relationships, and within groups of people. And there's a point at which it all becomes very tribal, and you could see how that would become desiccated within a family if it were to sort of run wild. And
I agree.
yeah.
Sorry, Paul.
No, it's okay.
I do agree. So much is stacking up there. I'll just
Yeah.
dump it and get out.
Yes, of course. You
No, because the abuse of therapy dogmas. I brought up transactional analysis here with respect to this victim triangle to acknowledge that that's where it's come from. But I can go back to 1991 when I had contact with the leading transactional analysis organization in the UK, because we were all part of another organization, and it was a meeting in London, and they were already showing the elements that would become woke.
Yeah.
And they were very allied with Gestalt therapy, a Gestalt group, which was also doing the same thing. And they've also co-opted Adler, and Jung was made for woke, because the idea of every man has an inner woman, and every woman has an inner man, you're immediately into identity politics and how that can be shifted around.
Yeah.
Whereas Freud has become the whipping post for woke and blamed for everything, blamed for the so-called patricide.
Yeah.
So all of this is going on, and people really have to be careful about the kind of therapy dogma that they're exposed to, or combination of them. So thank you, Paul. So moving on, family scapegoating. One member unconsciously bears the family's shadow. It's a Jungian term, to maintain systemic balance. In other words, the homeostasis of the family is dependent upon one person carrying the illness. And we found within marriages where one person bears an illness, if that person changes and becomes well, very often the spouse will become unwell. And it's as if they've done that to maintain the balance of the relationship beyond one person out of the two. So the sickness moves from one pole to the other, or the maladaptation does. It's remarkable. You can see it even with people who have psychotic symptoms. When they reduce and go away, then the healthy person can become or manifest apparently psychotic symptoms. There's certainly, with alternatives, it doesn't have to be the same. They can produce other symptoms of distress because the relationship that's held the family together has changed. But this idea of its Jungian origin, this shadow projection onto one member of the family, that is certainly real. You observe this. Then moving on, Adlerian. Moved too far on. Adlerian compensation neuroses. So overcompensation for feelings of inferiority driven by family, comparisons and pressures. Adler was very much into things like birth order, and how that affected how a child saw themselves and how someone bore the wound. So for him, the overcompensation that arose from that was the origin of his idea about inferiority and superiority complexes. In other words, the power dynamic, the capacity to assert. But he thought that asserting being healthy was better than asserting an overcompensation. He understood where the unhealthy compensation came from. But again, as we were saying before, he sought that outside of the family, that an individual should have social interest beyond it. But at least then they can come back to the family with a mature perspective on relating and can work with the family in a healthy way. But these things are always present within a family complex. This idea that one sibling is better or more achieved than the other, or mother prefers son over daughter, or father prefers daughter over son, but daughter prefers mother or doesn't like either of them. And all of this will generate different levels of inferiority, superiority, compensation, behavior. But the best way to understand all of this is through instincts. Once you get that, this whole differentiated field starts to lose its differentiation without losing the meaning of the field as a whole. And that's why transfers into infodynamics are helpful as we move on. Early relational patterns are unconsciously transferred into later relationships. Then you see the way that the genome has been trying to adjust for actual lived experience of an individual or a family. And the genome will do this, as we said earlier, by distorted or over-amplified Panksepian drives, seeking literally a context to fulfill them, which will heal everything that's gone before or might pop up later in a person's life. And the infodynamics are bigger than psychodynamics because they are of a whole field perspective. Psychodynamics, following both Freud and Jung, tend to collapse into individual relationships with a focus on one person. The field infodynamics must accommodate the field. Therefore, it also accommodates the genome and the ancestral psyche, and the anticipation that the genome and the ancestral psyche has for an optimized future development. We can say it that way, or we can say archetypes. And if you do that, you're going to bring all sorts of things in which are distractions We're bringing fantasies in. We're going to bring in the opportunity to blame people and say, you said that because of your anima. You did that because of your animus. You did that because of your shadow. You're just a persona. That kind of thing. Jungian language encourages that kind of desiccation and opposition, principally because Jungian language and concepts came through the lived experience of a man who was seriously neurotic and eventually psychotic. His model reflects that development. And insofar as he looks at the ancestral psyche in any way at all, he collapses them into fantasy representations. And he knew this, he knew it. As we've said before, he said, the archetypes are the self-portraits of the instincts. That means the instincts make the representations that we experience as archetypes. But it means that the representation is not the instinct, and that therefore it is not the genome. We're moving away from reality and into fantasy representation. Jung's method encourages that. It is a fact of lived experience. And if people are attached to the Jungian level of fantasies out there, they're just going to arrest themselves at that level of pre-adult adaptation. And that's what's going on out there at the moment. And if you bring that into a family dynamic situation where one person is full of Jungian fantasies and maybe one's based on Nietzsche or Jordan Peterson, that will be extremely disruptive to the whole family and will not provide a solution for the person who is suffering. But field infodynamics takes the ego out of itself without generating fantasies. That is such an important distinction. But not everybody is ready for taking that on as a responsibility for themselves to make those changes. And finally, codependency, which is a form of abuse that's leveled at people when they're seeking help. Sometimes it's real, but sometimes it's a misunderstanding of a situation to say that that relationship is codependent, but it is serving a homeostatic purpose. There is an attempt at healing going on here. And in order to be helpful, we have to go beyond the label whilst we make the observation and go into the field of instincts, and then bring about that regulatory change. So the genome agrees with what we're doing and releases the freedom for the next stage of adaptation. But other than that, these blurred boundaries and emotional over-involvement will create things like addiction to dysfunctional family roles. That's the downside of simply making an observation about codependency, but not doing anything to transform it into something else. That's where, for example, real alchemy comes about. When we change something from a state that it is in, that is unhelpful and hurtful, into something else. Tantrism does this all the time. It's all about transformation of representation and healing. But too many psychotherapy models are interested in maintaining the split because they get the secondary gain out of people remaining unadapted, unwell, and dependent in a codependent way on a so-called analyst. So there's some of the features, some of the salient features of the field of the family complex. We'll move on now to the last card. Leading family complex. Start at the bottom again, of course, with the roots of the tree. Rediscover the ancestral psyche. And to quote Plato, all knowledge is remembering. So if we hadn't ever discovered it, when we do, it is a kind of remembrance of an ancestral form of understanding that's been latent in us all along. And we haven't known it's there, but it has known we being the ego. Accessing that is the beginning of liberation. They are literally the roots of our psyche through our biology and into Plato. And we move on. Adapt to natural lifespan development, natural processes, not misfired configurations that have come about through complexes. This should be the aim that we have. I want to adapt to natural lifespan development, not become fixated, as too many young people do today, assisted in this by the misappropriation of Jungian-based fantasies through the culture, through pseudo-gurus and the internet. Idiots, in fact. Not the people who suffer, but the people who misdirect them. Accept peer confirmation. you do have to find your tribe. And I know that's a Podguru statement, but you do have to find it. But you need to relate to it in order to get genuine confirmation. If you go to a group which is a form of low-functioning cult, for example, you're not going to be confirmed in anything other than your attachment to that group. You need to be confirmed as an individual whose reciprocal confirmation is valuable to other people. And that recognition is based within the inherited understanding of the ancestral psyche. When it's genuine, it is felt, and it is as if the ages themselves are speaking and feeling through the people concerned. This is healing the lineage. This is healing the wounds of the past where they have existed. So if our own parents were not up to the job, you can be a good parent and you can heal what they didn't get right towards you and what they may have inherited through their family, but that wasn't right for them. So accept peer confirmation. You'll know it's real when it's reciprocal and you feel something that is very deep and it is not a cult, which is requiring you to conform with them before you get any confirmation at all. And cults always operate through suggestion and shared fantasies around someone who is elevating themselves into some kind of guru status, fake false guru status. Develop adult life partner relationships of whatever configuration, making no judgments about what they may be, but that capacity to move beyond the family and produce, develop and maintain long-term, perhaps for life, partner relationships shows that you are congruent with the genome. The genome will agree with that and will release other things as rewards for that. Because it's in the interest of the genome that we do it, even if we don't have children or want children, because a cohesive, long-term, stable relationship will bring about other benefits for us as individuals, but also for culture widely. So the capacity to do that is important, and that means no narcissism. You can't do this if you're a narcissist. Everything is fake and self-serving. Develop your own philosophy of life, one that you arrive at by a distillation of your own experience that is pressure tested. That way you have integrity in the philosophy of life that you have adopted. Otherwise, you're open to suggestion by receiving the influence of others. Whether that's an internet guru pushing Nietzsche or whatever it might be, or Carl Jung, or a religious one or anything like that, you're always going to be appropriated to the collective at a level which will not allow you to affirm your own life. Seeking meaning in the transpersonal. This is Adler, but extended. So it's not just social interest, it's transpersonal interest. This is, if you like, a proper relationship to what we collectively, all of us, understand as being the spiritual. It's a move on from only a philosophy of life. It's an ambition to achieve something which could be called a platonic level of consciousness, as a catch-all term for all kinds of transpersonal levels of understanding. Going to the top, discover your personal myth and realize your personal equation. You guys will all be familiar with what they mean. That's the ultimate goal, I would say, because that's a consolidation of the journey. Moving around, non-attachment. Let's move that back. To negative psychosocial and psychosomatic representations of the family complex. In other words, that which is emitted by the family complex as a shared understanding and experience, we must be non-attached to that, even if we can't change it for the other family members. That is a compassionate position to take. You could then say, I have my own philosophy of life. I've sought meaning in the transpersonal. I've developed adult life partner relationships. I have proper peer confirmation. I've adapted to natural lifespan developments. I've rediscovered the ancestral psyche. I've discovered my personal myth and realized my personal equation. I've done all of that. Now I can relate to my family without being harmed, but compassionately accept them for where they're at in their own life without blame or without requirement for them to change to meet my needs. And separate from codependency, of course. because I mentioned codependency in the sense of it having a potentially positive aspect to it. That's certainly true. But eventually it becomes a cage. It's something we are chained to because we are dependent upon the other. But once we separate from codependency and then competition, which is always latent within codependency, because that's an Adlerian drive to overcome inferiority through relationship by rank ordering our relationships. So the person who is then suddenly subdominant to us is literally that. And our dominance is dependence upon them accepting the subdominant role. And the subdominant role person says, I'd be in an even worse state if I didn't allow myself to be dominated by this other person. That's an aspect of codependency, the negative. Separate from competition and identification with siblings. That's part of curing through compassion, our relationship to the family. And then finally, the beginning, as far as Jung was concerned, separate from the psychology of the parents. That's the hardest one to achieve, but Jung suggested it was the first step. Did he achieve it? Arguably he didn't, but at least he knew how important it was to be able to do that. Then at least we can see the parents as human beings. We can forgive them for that. We can forgive them for what's affected them. There is non-attachment but compassion in that. And we can also stop ourselves making the mistakes that may have been passed down to them by their parents, grandparents, and so on. We break the chain of association of a family complex. And of course, without that, as he said, there is no individuation because the residual influence of the parents is still there. That's pretty much some of the essentials of leaving the family complex. Just as before, we had some, because there are so many more, but some of the salient aspects of the field of the family complex. Right. Time to throw it open if anybody feels up to it after all that. Would anybody like to? Would you?
Niamh's got a case study that she wanted to.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, of course.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, Ben, do you look?
Oh, sorry, Ben.
Your face fell a little bit.
There's probably time for both.
It's okay.
There will be time. Yeah.
It's okay if there isn't time. Let's do the case study. I think that's great.
Oh.
It's not necessarily a case, but I was approached last night. And I just got all the relevant information. So it's actually this woman's daughter. It's in Mexico as well. So my son has just come back from Mexico. So he knows the people that are involved as well. So I could actually run a few things by him later on. So this daughter is a 16-year-old, and her mother has separated from the father. I think it's about 6 years.
Adjusting the volume. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. So the mother separated from the father. So what happened in their relationship? So she was about 11, I think, at the time. So actually, the daughter. The mother has 5 children, and she went through surrogacy, and the father was against that. He didn't want it, but she still continued to do it. So what's driving her to do that when she already has her 5 and everything else? So that's in the background. And then the mother went on to have a relationship with this guy who to me sounds like Matisse from Benidorm or something. I mean, he's tried to hit on every woman that's gone to this place in Mexico. And he already has a family. I mean, he has a wife. And they've started this business that they bring tours around Mexico. And she started this business as well of bringing kids from America over and giving them this 3 or 6 months experience of, Mexican adventure and finding out before they go to college what they want to do and blah, blah, blah. And it sounds all lovely and dovely, but in practice, she's neglecting her own children in the process. And this 16-year-old is my son knows of the girl, has spoken, and he said that all the children are very well-behaved kids. And they have to be kind of involved in the mother's work of the theatre group and everything else. And it's kind of ironic because it was Matilda, the play that they were doing, that the daughter just went bonkers on the final night of the play. And on the way home in the car, there was another woman present, and she was involved, saying, "Stop doing this, stop doing that." And this woman I think this woman does human design or something, and she thinks she's this mega guru and knows everything. And David said her son is the most obnoxious child you've ever met in your entire life. So it's just the complexity of this whole thing. No wonder the daughter is lashing out. The daughter jumped out of the car that night and everything else. And what this woman's response, who is a facilitator for all these teenagers, her approach was to get all these mothers on a Zoom call and all us women stick together and help each other out. So my sister was part of that group. And I just thought, for starters, that's so toxic. It's a breach of complete confidence for that daughter to do such a thing. So my sister was actually saying, will I take on this child's case? Like, would you be interested? And my thing is, how do I do it from here? And my son's girlfriend works for this woman as well. So the father is also getting married, and that's another key at the moment. So no wonder the daughter, she's a 16-year-old, she has no guidance. She calls the guy creepy, and it was interpreted as if he was a predator. And now the mother is saying, do you know what you've done? How is my business going to be? So.
Wow, Niamh. Good luck. Well, it's immensely complicated, isn't it? And there is so much vested interest at so many different levels. I mean, I would have to say if anyone could help her, it would be you. But it does show the complexity of these things, and the power of instinct, even down to driving things like surrogacy, but also what happens when instinct runs out, in the sense that it doesn't allow for other things to come online, with respect to things like creativity and personal development. And this it's certainly for women anyway, it can take them by surprise, I think, even if they've been very invested in that reproductive sense, in growing a family, and maybe even growing a family for somebody else, that when that runs out, well, it's a bit like, what's next? And there are a lot of books out there on feminine psychology, sort of past and presently, that address these kinds of themes for women, to do with what happens when I mean, a good example would be, say, the kind of middle class housewife of the 1950s, who appears to have it all, and builds the nuclear family and all of that, and all the material concerns are taken care of. But then there's the question of, well, what next? And of course, this is where things like second wave feminism in particular have picked up on that dissatisfaction, if you like, that not quite knowing what it is that's wrong, but there is something missing, and run with it, and obviously politicize it and all the rest of it. But that's another story in a way. But I think what it shows this particular case study is the kind of conflicts that women get into, to do with their own instincts, really, to do with the drive to create, have families, to care for families. But if they have the potential to have something more than that, then they also have conflicting instincts around that will be pushing simultaneously to the reproductive ones. And from what you've said, the way you've described this particular example, it seems as if it's taken somebody like this guy, who obviously, she doesn't appear to have a very good read on, but nonetheless he is animating her in a way that is completely different to anything that she can experience within the context of having children and raising children. And it seems to be that that animation is so strong, that she's and people do this all the time, don't they? They they put their own discretion about such things to one side, and it's such a powerful force, the desire to create something, that all the safeguards and everything that should be instantly obvious as red flags get completely overlooked. So, I mean, there are so many casualties potentially in the scenario that you described, aren't there? There's so much fallout, and so many angles that with which you could come at that. And obviously, having a field perspective is the ideal, because it will allow you to take everything into account while you decide on, well, firstly, whether or not you want to take this particular case on, but also how you are likely to deal with that. And your relationship to this young woman is going to be so different from anything that she could possibly get from this kind of collective sisterhood that you describe, which it's not even collective positively, is it? It's
No, it's not.
collective in a toxic way.
No, it's really toxic.
Yeah, it is. And if you do take this case on, I'm sure you will distill out what this young woman needs for her own stability
Yeah.
going forwards. And I think to have somebody like yourself with that consistency of approach, but also the insight into the wider context, the wider field of her situation, would be very good for her. Of course it would, because everything else
Sorry,
is negative for her.
but her father, David said, is a nice guy.
Right. Yes. Yes.
He's moved on. Do you know what I mean? And he doesn't want to get in the soup, which I don't blame him.
Sure.
This whole
Yeah.
scenario.
Yeah. But she needs someone who can
Yeah.
be a positive role model for her femininity. And obviously, a father, as good as he might be and as good as the relationship might be between them, it's still not what she needs, is it? What she needs is what I've just said.
Yeah.
She's not going to get it from the kind of women who are, involved in their own kind of cultish sort of predation on her. She needs somebody who's clean of all of that, and it's going to be a rite of passage for her, isn't it? Really, into womanhood, if she can get someone who can do the right things for her, or guide her in that ancestral sense through the transition. That's probably what she needs. But it's going to be down to you, Niamh, isn't it? Whether you want to take that on or not, of course.
Yeah, it's the mother has no intention of listening to anything of what the daughter is saying. So when I said to David, like, about the daughter in general doesn't like having people around at the house, and last night the whole crew were going around to her house for the end of party kind of celebration of this play, Matilda.
Yes.
And already the daughter, because of her behaviour, has been grounded for 2 weeks already and has her mobile phone and has this whole 36 people coming around,
Yes.
which she thinks is way too much.
Yes. So in many ways, the daughter is actually expressing more maturity than the mother. It's what you said earlier, Steve, about the puer aeternus. This is the puella aeternus, isn't it? Yeah. It's the feminine or female equivalent of that. And while her mother is in that state, she's not in the right state to help her, teenage daughter make a proper transition into womanhood. So that needs somebody who does have experience and maturity and the right kind of experience and maturity to be able to do that for her. So I think you'll be very well placed, Niamh.
Yeah.
I absolutely do.
But this day I just think about it because of David and his relationship with
Of course, which do make it more difficult. Of course they do. Yeah.
and my niece is in her drama.
Yeah.
But I did lay out a lot to my sister about what has gone on and to listen more to your own partner and what he has said in the past.
Yes.
Everything.
Yeah.
And to stop wobbling around these people that are very unstable.
Yes, indeed.
And relate and listen to your own daughter and what her needs are.
Yeah.
So there's lessons to be learned there.
Yes. I mean, even if you fulfilled more of a psychopomp role than a clinical role, you're still in a position to help. Yeah, you could still do a huge amount of good. Absolutely. Yes.
It's never easy, but it might be easier to do that.
Yes.
To manage all the different
Oh gosh.
elements of one family plus the tensions each family member has with the extended two. That's a lot to manage.
It's huge, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. It's a toughie.
Yeah.
It sounds like a bit of a SHIT hole. My sister is living in, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
On the surface, you see, it's always on the surface, it looks all glossy and everything else. And another thing that stood out to me was that this woman says, I love the energy of teenagers, they're great. And I was going, okay, so she had her kids very young. Did she feel like she missed out?
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you've fulfilled that role within your own family. Not so much I don't mean that you're a scapegoat, but you're the member of the family that sees through. I'm going to use your expression back at all the bullshit basically.
Yeah.
See through it all of it. It doesn't escape you. It doesn't get past you at all. And it's a very difficult place to be because to what extent do you point things out, and to what extent do you just allow people to get on with it, because you know that even if you were direct and you pointed certain things out, it wouldn't necessarily make any difference anyway. But the person who occupies that role in a family, it can be very difficult for them, can be very challenging. But I think you are that person for your family. I think your intuition is such as you just penetrate it all. You just see what's going on. And some members are more willing to pay attention than others, it seems. And it is particularly difficult with sisters, again, for the reasons that you were saying about siblings, Steve, because of the rivalry between sisters, for example, is enough to make it something that it's just on the basis of that alone precludes sometimes any kind of positive outcome, because it just ardor just powers through, and the rivalry just persists over time. But I think you're in a situation now where you understand, you can see enough to just step away, and if you have to let them all get on with it. But you also have the capacity, you have the ego strength, I believe, to go back and interact with any member of your family now without being destabilized by that.
No, I agree completely.
Yeah,
And I've really,
that point.
I had your session with my husband, I had written it out, thank God, because I lost it on WeTransfer.
Oh.
But I had written it out.
Gosh.
Yeah, because
Yeah, well, that's
profound.
Yes.
Well, it was profound because of what you guys did that day. And my brother rang, and he was drunk, and he's been drunk an awful lot. And he says, "What are you up to?" And I started reading what you had said to Gary that day.
Yes.
I said, "Oh, I just found this notebook." Well, it was actually Gary who found the notebook. And he said, "Do you mind if I read this notebook? It's all I'm very scattered all the notes in it." But Gary was reading it,
Yeah.
and he was going like, that really changed the way I felt about myself, what you did that day, you guys. And so I started doing this yesterday with my brother to see if anything will land.
Yes.
And it is about ego strength and his own self-concept, and he's at that age in his midlife crisis kind of shit as well. So
Yeah. 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 You're like I say, Niamh, you're giving back hugely to other people, and you're now in that great position really, which is come through your own hard work, your own ethic, your own character, to be able to move in and out of the family constellation in the way that you do, so you can do the kinds of things that you've just described now, where you can say something in a way that's intended to be helpful, and healing, but at the same time you can step back as much as you need to, and you don't divest energy and things that aren't going to go anywhere. And it's a great place to be, isn't it? And it's possible to get there as well for anyone who might be watching, who feels that the whole life is taken up or taken over by the kind of family that they've inherited. We can deal with these things. It doesn't have to be all or nothing either. It doesn't have to be the only way that I can have anything to do with them is to have a complete separation and a kind of a very negative takedown of them. It is possible to still see some of the good things that exist from within it, but to not allow the more harmful things to persist and affect us, or affect the person negatively going forward. So what you've done there is you've described the sheer complexity of families just in that one example, but also even with that degree of complexity, how it's possible to be involved but to stand apart. And that's, like I say, that's a really good place to be. You'll know when you've got there. You really will. Because it does mean that you are capable, if you absolutely have to, of walking away as well.
Well, that's it. That's the part that you need to realize. What energy level am I at?
Yes.
At any given time.
Yes.
And I did say to my husband yesterday, I said, "Okay, that's a bit enough. Oh, family stuff."
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Yeah. 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 That's healthy. That's homeostatic. That's
absolutely.
good self-regulation. All of those things.
Yeah. And again, I don't need to pick up the phone just because it keeps ringing.
Yes. 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 Yeah. At a time and moment of your convenience, really, isn't it? Sometimes.
Well, most of the time isn't to say hello, how are you? How you do? Well, so you're going to get to know that as well, the pattern.
Yeah.
And that's what I was reading yesterday, actually, as well. Milton Erickson patterns.
Oh, were you? Yes. Yes.
It's a clear indication. Anyway, thanks for all that.
Thank you so much, Niamh. Thank you for sharing. That's most helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Niamh.
Yeah.
Ben.
Oh my goodness.
Oh,
Oh man. I'm trying to shift back from what was just talked about. It's quite something, and I think on the last card, several, points, and one of them was separating yourself from parental psychology. What struck me is, in an effort to do that, how important the ancestral psyche becomes. To again, in a way, we're separating from parental psychology, but at the same time, we're also going to the wider field of parenthood, to heal from the damage or hurts from the parents themselves, and so it's not that we separate from the psychology of the parents and we create something new. It is that we refer back to the ancestral psyche and to see what's all conserved within us, again, as you've said in the past, a good student will learn from a bad teacher, and I think that principle applies here. And what we learn, the good students learning good things goes beyond the field of the teacher or the parent in this context. So that was powerful to me. So there are other things there too, but I realize we're running out of time, so I'll be careful with that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
But I don't know if I'm modeling that accurately or not, but it's just yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can heal the parents you've had through the ancestral representations, without a doubt. And again, altered states of consciousness make this happen much more easily, because cognition puts up the illusion that you can't do that because it's irrational. No, it's not. It's real. These representations are in the genome. It's the only reason you ever related to your parents is because the ancestral psyche determined that you should. Without that, it would never have happened. We need to go back to those ancestral elements and liberate them so they can come into the world.
And again, the template, doesn't come. It partly comes from relating to parents or how the parents relate to you, but the template, that's not a permanent thing, permanent template, in that the imprinting is from the ancestral psyche, and to I mean, that is so hopeful to me for healing. It's profoundly hopeful that we're not stuck repeating what we observed, or believing that is the template that we need to live by, and it opens the door to healing and change. I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, it is. And for all reasons that you say, yeah, there's so much in there. We have to build a vessel to receive it, though. And that's difficult because we attach to the illusions that we attach to complexes. But when we don't, then the vessel begins to form, and then we become the craftsperson who makes it. It's almost like an Aristotelian process.
Yeah.
All efficient material and final cause of the vessel, and we have to make the final cause want to come in, and then it's done.
I think that, on the going back to the card, I think the rest of the topics that you covered allowed for that. It's all configured to allow for the healing and change. For example, receiving peer confirmation or peer affirmation, that is incredibly important.
Yes.
Yeah, it is, Ben. I think not enough sometimes is said about the importance of that. You're so right. And it just depends what you mean by a peer group, because sometimes people believe they're in a peer group and they're absolutely not. They're certainly not amongst peers. And, if they have a Adlerian superiority complex, they might believe they are because of the compensated inferiority that keeps them down and keeps them contained within a group that's not representative of their potential at all. And sometimes it can be really hard to convince someone of that, because if they feel accepted, the social acceptance, which of course is at one level instinctive, is so strong that they don't see the fact that actually they don't really fit in at all.
Yeah.
And it happens a lot, particularly obviously with young people. But persuading them of that can be difficult. So what we mean by a peer group is really important.
Yeah.
And I can remember you saying that to me, actually. It's a very long time ago, Steve, about when I believed I was with my peers. And you said, well, you're absolutely not.
Yeah.
And, talking decades and
Yeah.
decades ago now, but you did.
I did.
And obviously I've remembered that. And yeah, be very careful about that. It's one to be really careful of, I think, because they will keep you down, they will close you down. You will not individuate if they are the wrong people.
Yeah, you have to let go of a lot.
Oh yeah.
Secondary gain. I mean, yeah, I'm not being rude, but
No, I just like you saying that at all.
there is always some form of secondary gain to maintain an attachment, which is
Yes.
constraining us.
Yes.
Otherwise, homeostasis would completely disagree.
Yes.
But it will agree if we don't move, but there's some advantage.
Yeah.
But you did. You did break away. It's a lot of courage, because you had a lot of reinforcement to staying with them and fighting battles that didn't benefit you
That's true. Yes.
at all. It didn't even really benefit your patients, did it?
No, it didn't. No.
It's part of the power group within the
Yeah.
hierarchy in hospital.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If that wasn't inappropriate disclosure.
No, not at all, because we all have to find someone we trust sufficiently to help us make corrections. And I think the capacity to be able to self-reflect and correct is all part of it, isn't it? And if you can't do that, if you don't have that capacity, I think, quite frankly, you shouldn't be working in this field, because we ask other people to do it all the time.
Yeah.
And so it has to start at home. So I don't have any problem with you saying that at all. Like I say, it's a very long time ago, but it was absolutely it was an absolutely necessary form of correction for me personally.
Yeah, can change someone's life doing that.
It can, yeah.
Whereas in the moment they see the life as, this is okay.
Yes.
It's not.
No,
No.
because everything's capped by complexes, isn't
I
it?
think, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It-
Competing meta instincts as
Yes.
well,
Yeah.
which is even more difficult to see than the complexes.
Yeah.
Is that, what does the genome want? And if it's not releasing fully, why not? And it's that's because you're not you, but any of us, we're not adapting to our potential.
Yeah.
So it switches off. We move in the direction of our latent potential, the genome switches on, and then it's released for us.
Yeah.
It's an area of easy unconsciousness.
Oh yes, it is. It is. Yeah. Yeah. You see it in support groups as well all the time, don't you?
Yeah.
Where they keep people trapped, people who really should be moving on from them, and have the ability to move on, but they get contained within the collective belief that somehow they all share a potential, and then they all share a psychology, and so on. They all share a particular illness, let's say.
Yeah.
And again, you can see Adler at play in that scenario.
That's an extension sometimes of the family.
It is.
If the family have conditioned people to say it's okay to represent a shared psychosomatic representation, the person moves out of the family into a work environment, and then a few significant enough people are doing the same thing. You just induct that.
That's right.
You get infected. It's a psychological, as Jung called it, psychological infection, which somatizes.
Yeah.
That's awful, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
We've all been through it, but it's awful.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes,
Yeah.
just the right ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Ben, I think you were going to elaborate a little more.
Well, I might be opening a can of worms here. I think religious institutions do the same thing too. So
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, they'd be sorry.
Maybe we could address that at some point, depending on how you feel about that. But as a general topic, that could be something going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, we're talking about suggestion and influence, aren't we? Again, so yes, absolutely.
It all starts with the family.
Yeah.